Hi, my name is Aimee Easterling, and I write werewolf books on the border between urban fantasy and paranormal romance. And I'm going to be talking to you today about shapeshifters of all sorts, but especially about werewolves. But before I dive into that, I want to tell you that this is pre-recorded, as you can probably tell. The reason is that I live out in the boondocks. Our internet is really awful, so I couldn't depend on being able to talk to you at the moment. However, I am going to try to make this interactive anyway through the chat feature, and I'm hopefully, if my internet is being good, then I will also be present both here and in the chat feature in the future, chatting with you guys. And at the end, if I'm actually present, if my internet's working, we'll do a little bit of interactive stuff. Alright, but moving on to werewolves and shapeshifters in general. I want to start out by telling you about a little bit about my writing journey and how it relates to werewolves. Obviously, my books are about werewolves, but they have a deeper importance in my writing career than that. About 10 years ago, I had been making a part-time living writing homesteading nonfiction, but I started wondering whether I could perhaps start writing fiction. Fiction was my very first love. As soon as I learned to write, I started writing stories. I wrote my first novel-length story when I was probably in late elementary school, and I've just been obsessed with fiction ever since. But I hadn't really tried to take it very seriously since college, when I wrote a few novels and sent out some feelers to publishers, and of course nobody wanted them. So I gave up and I moved on to other things. But once my nonfiction started doing well, I thought to myself, you know what? Maybe I should try some fiction. That is my first true love. So I sat down and I wrote a story, a novel, called Watermelon Summer. It was about a woman, well, this was really about a younger woman, a teenager, who was estranged from her father. And in the course of the story, she gets drawn into this tangled web of biological family and their difficulties resulting from that. But in the end, she finds found family who aren't biological but fill that niche in her heart, and so there's a happy ending. So that book, I self-published it just like I had self-published my nonfiction. And as you might have suggested, it crashed and burned. I'm not sure if I ever made back the cost of the cover, but I certainly didn't make more than that. So I had two options here. I could just give up on this fiction dream, or I could try to write something that people wanted a little bit more. So I made a list of the things that I really loved in fiction, and then I took a look at the bestseller chart on Amazon, and I looked at the things that clearly other people loved in fiction, because they were able to be up on the bestseller chart. And what I found, where our little Venn diagrams interlocked here, was werewolves. I liked werewolves, readers liked werewolves. I was like, you know what, why don't I write a book with werewolves in it? So I proceeded to write a different but similar story about a woman who is estranged from her father, and she gets drawn into this tangled web of difficult family and finds belonging with found family instead. So yeah, it obviously was not the exact same story, but the theme was very similar. I did the same thing. I self-published it. This time I didn't even trust myself to buy a cover, because I was like, gee, I don't want to lose money, so I made a homemade cover, which was not very good. I slapped it up on Amazon, and that book took off. It did so well that I was like, whoa, what am I doing writing this nonfiction? I should be writing more fiction about werewolves. Fast forward ahead a few years, and I was making a full-time living for our family off of werewolf books. So what's the trick? Am I saying that you should just drop everything and slap a werewolf in whatever story you're working on? No, obviously not. But what I'm saying is that werewolves are a sweet spot. They are a trope that readers really like, and it's handy to look at a trope like that and consider whether it might work well in your stories. So when I say the word trope, I know that turns a lot of people off. because we think of a trope as something that's overused. It's something you've read or seen 1,000 times before. There's nothing new. You're just regurgitating old stuff. And is that true? It can be true. But does it have to be true? No. In my opinion, a trope is very simply, imagine you have 2 chocolate chip cookies on a tray. This chocolate chip cookie has 3 chocolate chips in it. This chocolate chip cookie has 20 chocolate chips in it. Which one do you choose? Well, I choose the 20 chocolate chip cookie. And what are those chocolate chips? I think of each cookie as a story, and the chocolate chips are the tropes. So they're just sweet spots. They're things that you see it in a blurb and you're automatically like, you know, let's consider this book. Because I've always liked lone wolves who get drawn into a pack and there's a domineering alpha, but she's able to hold her own, and so forth and so on. That's a lot of tropes right there, but you can shake them up, throw in some of your own independent elements, and you come up with a story that's not only sweet and is the cookie that the readers are going to pick off the tray, excuse me, but is also something fun that you enjoy writing. So before we go on, I want you to take a minute and think about, obviously, you find shifters of some sort interesting, or you wouldn't be listening to me ramble on about them. So pull up your chat if you can, which I don't actually know what it'll look like yet, so I can't help you, but hopefully it's obvious. And I'd like you to spend just a minute writing down things that you are interested in about shifters. Like, are there elements, are there specific types of shifters you love? Are there elements of shifter stories that you love? And while you're at it, I also want you to write down what your favorite genre or genres are. And you don't have to be specific here. You don't have to say mail order bride, historical romance. Just romance is fine. Or horror or science fiction or literary fiction or whatever you really like to read and watch and write. All right, while you're thinking about that and writing it down, I want to tell you a little bit about the history of shifters. And the reason I want to talk about the history of shifters is to help you understand that a trope is not just an overused part of the popular conversation. A trope is often a trope because it's something that we have a deep-seated affinity to as a species. So if you think about the hero's journey, if any of you have read the book Save the Cat, or have maybe gone back to the original Campbell and read the hero's journey, and you think about, when you're writing a story, you think about that inciting incident, the call to action, the high point, the all is lost point. That is one example of something that we believe may be part of the human cultural imperative. And we're drawn to the hero's journey because of who we are as a species. So I think of tropes as a similar thing, where we're drawn to certain tropes because of what we are as a species. The reason they're overused is because they're very evocative. And we can look at that by looking and seeing how far back shifters go in history. So I'm going to base some of this on this book, Shapeshifters, A History by John Kachuba. And I went to this guy's talk a while ago, and he had some really fun points that he told me about, and I'm going to regurgitate a few of them here. I do recommend his book, but also I'm going to have a PDF handout that you should be able to get, I'm hoping, in the chat at the end, so that you can look this up later. Especially, I wrote up a blog post after going to his talk, and that'll give you some of these high points. You don't have to scratch down every single thing I say. If something's interesting, it will probably be in that blog post, and I will link to that in the PDF. So, just to give your pen hand a break. So, John Kachuba and various other people believe that shapeshifters, our interest in them goes back tens of thousands of years. I know that's a very long time, but I'm going to show you a few pictures here. First of all, let's take a look at this image, which I can't quite see the shapeshifter in this, but scientists believe this is a human-animal hybrid, which is found on a cave wall from 44,000 years ago in Indonesia. Now that one's a little bit, I don't know, but take a look at this second picture, which is a much more easy to understand image. I can see in this picture a human. If you look down at the bottom, there are human feet with human toes. Obviously this being is not just a human though, because he has a tail, he's got antlers, he seems to though have maybe human fingers, it's hard to say. This drawing is from cave art from the southwest of France, from, I didn't write it down, but I believe it was about 15,000 years ago. This is called the sorcerer, and scientists believe it might be a combination of an owl, a wolf, a stag, and a human. And this is all going back to talk about shamanism, which is believed to be one of the roots of the shapeshifter myth, or maybe the root, it's hard to say. What scientists now believe is that shamans did, and to some extent do, because there are modern studies of Siberian nomads that show their shamans exhibit this behavior. Shamans would believe that they could take on the, not necessarily the physical form of an animal, but more an intellectual, brain-related shape-shifting, where you might take some drugs to get to this point, or you might do a lot of drumming, or various ways of altering your consciousness so that you believe for a while that maybe you're a bear, or maybe you're a stag, or an owl, or a wolf, or whatever it is. And the belief was that the shamans used this shape-shifting in order to help them get into the minds of animals to prepare for hunts, because most of the cultures that we're talking about were hunters, so these were people who were going to have to go out, and you know, they couldn't just go to the grocery store and the beef was going to be on the shelf where it was last week. No, they had to go out and hope there was going to be a mammoth somewhere within walking distance. So that's the shamanistic belief about shapeshifters, and that may have colored all of the later myths. It's hard to tell. Obviously we don't have written evidence from 40,000 years ago. We can only look at modern cultures, which there are very few left, which have shamanistic elements, or we can look at cave art and things like that. So moving on to more modern examples of shape-shifting, fast forward ahead to the 11th and 12th century AD in Scandinavia, berserkers, they would actually put on the hide of a bear or a wolf or some other scary predatory animal before they went into battle, and the idea was that they believed that this gave them the ferocity of that animal. So again, it was more of a mental shape-shifting, which I'll come back to because that is one element of werewolf stories that's really fun, is the whole dual human-animal nature. Another example is Egyptian therianthropy, which therianthropy just means shape-shifting. And these are, as you'll see in this picture, or you've probably seen lots of times if you've studied any Egyptian art, there were all kinds of statues of human-animal hybrids. And you move ahead, Greek and Roman mythology, there are scads of shapeshifters. Although they didn't think of them as shapeshifters, it was more like a god would take on the form of a bull, or a person would take on the form of a flower, which I don't know if that counts as a shapeshifter if you're changing into a plant instead of an animal, but you are shifting your shape. A lot of these shapeshifters in Greek and Roman mythology were used to seduce women, of all things, which, as we move forward, you know, romance is a major genre with shapeshifters in it, so maybe we've got some things some threads moving through from there too. And of course these myths, I'm skipping a lot of myths. There are all kinds of stories about selkies that shed their skin to become human, and werewolves and so forth, but I'm trying to stick to things that people may have believed were actually there in the real world and not just a story. there's the Navajo tradition of skinwalkers, which is still believed by some that these are witches, usually bad witches, the skinwalkers are, who can disguise themselves as animals. Werewolves, which is the classic, of course, they were believed to be real in Europe all the way up into at least the 18th century France. There was an example of a supposed werewolf that was written up in newspaper articles for killing people. And as recently as 1996 in India, there are newspaper stories of supposedly werewolves out killing people. And then a kind of more whimsical story from recent history. In Argentina, there's a belief that if you're the seventh son of a seventh son, you're in danger of becoming a werewolf. But all seventh sons of seventh sons are adopted by the president. I don't think the president actually takes them into his home, but it's kind of more of a, just like the virtual shape-shifting of shamanism, by making them no longer the children of their parent, they're no longer the seventh son of a seventh son, so they're not in danger of becoming a werewolf. So there are all kinds of interesting stories out there, and as you start thinking about putting shifters into your own art, it's very interesting to go back to some of these stories, because especially the less common ones will give you a way of tapping into this shared consciousness that makes shapeshifters so interesting without also boring yourself to tears by just regurgitating the same information. So why are we so interested that we have been talking about shapeshifters for 40-some thousand years? What is it specifically that gets us really interested in shapeshifters? So I just jotted down some common sub-tropes within the trope, and this is specifically werewolves, just because that's what I know the best. But you can think a lot of different shapeshifters have some elements of these. There are various things that people often put in stories, and some of these are mutually exclusive, so you obviously don't want your werewolf stories to have all of these. And I found it's most interesting, especially if you pick one of these and really focus on that and twist it around a little bit so your story gets very focused and interesting. So some common werewolf tropes, you've got the whole change at the full moon, or sometimes you instead change when you're angry, kind of like the Incredible Hulk. You got the whole inner beast deal, where you look human on the outside, but you've got these instincts of a wolf on the inside, and it makes you do strange things. Maybe you do go off on violent rampages or whatever. There's the weaknesses of werewolves, which are supposed to include silver, the plant called monkshood or wolfsbane, or mistletoe. There's the whole deal about whether you want to have your werewolves be bitten wolves or hereditary wolves. Bitten wolves, of course, are based on the European tradition that werewolves werewolfism spreads a bit like a disease. So if I was a werewolf and I bit you, then you won't even realize what was happening, but then the next full moon you'll change into a wolf. And so that is interesting, especially if you're in the more horror side of the genre. And that's something we're going to get to in a minute, is that some of these tropes really lend themselves to certain genres a lot more than others. Although, again, it can be really fun to take a trope that seems like it lends itself more to one genre and twist it around so that it's getting explored by another genre. There's some werewolves are immortal. Some werewolves have werewolf amnesia, so you change into wolf form, you go out and run around and do all these things, then you come home, fall asleep in your bed, you wake up, you don't remember any of the things you did, but maybe, you see some blood on the sheet, what happened? So that's a classic trope of werewolves. The painful shift is another classic trope. In some stories, werewolves are actually breaking their bones as they change from wolf to human or human to wolf, and it may take a long time. It may be very painful. Another trope is that they'll change back to their true form when they die, which I'm not sure if their true form would be wolf or human. I guess it depends on the story. On the other hand, you start getting into some of the really positive traits of werewolves. Some of them have super healing, so it makes perfect sense, which I often use in my books, if you're able to shift between human and wolf form and you break your leg in wolf form, if you shift to human form, it should reset that bone. So it may not heal exactly, although in some books it would just heal. But the bone is no longer a compound fracture. Now it's a simple fracture or whatever. Many werewolves are portrayed as being very physically strong. That can be fun. What I particularly like is letting werewolves have heightened senses in human form. So if I were a werewolf, I would be hearing the highway over there and be driving me crazy, even though really I only hear it if there's a really loud truck going by. Or maybe in human form I can smell that over there was a deer yesterday or whatever. So that's a fun trope to play with. And then you can think about animal instincts even in human form, and that gets us into the more behavioral side of werewolf behavior, which often has to do with the pack. So some people would say that scientifically it's very frustrating that in fiction werewolf packs have this dominant alpha who's almost always a male, and then you may have a beta who's like the second in command. It goes all the way down through this pecking order, down to the omega who's here at the bottom, who's picked on and it's awful. Or if you look at Patricia Briggs' books, the omega has this secret weapon and that everybody loves her because she is the bottom of the totem pole. But however you look at it, that whole pack hierarchy is very intrinsic to a lot of werewolf stories. But it's very frustrating to scientists because they say, look, the average real werewolf pack consists of a mated pair, and they're both in charge, and their children. And the children often obey them because, you know, we often do what our parents tell us to do, no matter what species we are. But it's not like there's this special alpha and this omega or whatever. But I would argue that the whole idea of a werewolf, we're obviously writing these stories for people, not for wolves. So what is most interesting about werewolves to us as a reader and as a writer is where it illuminates parts of the human experience. So I think that power dynamics are very important to humans. The social network is very important to humans, and I think using that in the werewolf world can be really fun. So sticking with that whole pack structure deal, some more sub-tropes that have to do with werewolves. Sometimes the alpha can compel obedience. So if I was the alpha wolf, I could say something to you and you would have to go do the dishes. That'd be fun. Anyway, that's not usually what they use it for. There's the trope that the alpha is the most dominant one in the pack, and that you could replace me as alpha by challenging me to physical combat, and you win and you become alpha. Usually you have to kill me and you become alpha. There's also an inherent sexism that is in many examples of the werewolf pack. And I actually find that fun to play with because my heroes are women and they battle against that and they win and maybe they become the alpha. And so the underdog story is always fun. And there you go. Look, we talk about the underdog. We clearly have this deep interest in the whole lupine or dog social structure and how it combines with the human social structure. And another fun trope that often gets thrown out there is the clothes issue. If you're going to be shifting back and forth between wolf and human, clothes either shred off or, you know, they will just wriggle out of them, or they'll actually take their clothes off before they shift, and then they'll shift back from being a wolf and suddenly you're a naked human. And I find this lots of fun to play with when you think about the romantic element of werewolf books or stories. Alright, so now that I've thrown out there just a bunch of reasons to love werewolves, I thought we'd look at some actual data. So I polled various types of readers about what they love most about werewolves. And I started, one example that I'm going to show you here is from my own email list. Now, keep in mind that this example is obviously people who like books that are on the border between urban fantasy and paranormal romance. So this is not a good example of why horror readers like werewolf books. And young adult readers are not very well portrayed here. I would argue that the young adult reader may really enjoy thinking of the shift for a werewolf as being similar to the transformation of puberty. That is one reason that the young adult reader might like it. The horror reader might especially like it for the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde element. Sorry, the birds are a little loud today. That was a pileated woodpecker, in case you could hear it back there. So just a reminder that you can be writing out your favorite tropes in the chat now that I've run through some of them, because we will be going at the end comparing the tropes that you found interesting based on genre. And now would be a good time to write it out there, because I'm going to tell you what other readers have thought, and I don't want to spoil your own feelings with the data. Alright, so to move back to my email list. Now these people on my email list, I let them check as many boxes as they want, so you'll notice these numbers do not add to 100%. But when you look at my email list, the very most beloved reason for reading werewolf books, and well, first let me back up. I put things in categories, because if I had listed, 3 dozen tropes, it would have taken people forever and they wouldn't have read it all. So I just summed them up into a few categories, which I'll explain as I go along. So the most beloved category was the whole dual animal human nature, the whole idea of the beast within. This is often shown as the internal struggle with your dark half, or the emotions and desires that as a human we suppress. You're obviously not going to go out and kill a deer with your teeth, but maybe especially in the horror genre, that's something you would really like to play with. I don't write in that genre, but in the fantasy genre or the romance genre, I find it interesting, especially with female protagonist werewolves, to have the werewolf nature be the things that society tells us not to do, that aren't necessarily deadly, but would make people think that I was very rude, So that's something to play with. The second most favorite reason that my readers gave for reading werewolf books is the whole mate element, and this one's pretty simple and self-explanatory. Subsets of the mate element are the hot alpha, the one true mate, the fated mate, and this goes back to the whole dominance issue. Like in romance, often a common trope is the very rich guy, or the CEO, whatever. And in a way, a werewolf alpha is just an example of that same trope. So the whole mate element, but there's also the trope of true love, and finding your soulmate. And so the fated mate is fulfilling that trope. Alright, the third reason, which is also pretty close, over half of my readers gave this as something they love about werewolf books, is the whole superpower deal. The healing, the immortality, whatever in your world building gives them the superpowers. Moving down to just a little less than half of my readers really love the found family pack element. This is something that I particularly love, and I write about a lot in my books. And some subsets of this are the pack bonds, which can be really interesting. You can make them you can make it be telepathy in wolf form. You can make pack bonds let you physically see things that we humans can only, guess at, how much so-and-so likes so-and-so. And another subset of this category is the whole trope of lone wolves finding a pack. And then a little over a third of my readers said they like werewolf books because wolves are just cool, and it is true. Wolves are just cool. a little over a year ago, I went on a trip to Yellowstone National Park, which was led by naturalists, and it was a week going out and sitting in the snow in really cold weather, staring at wolves through what scientists call scopes, which are telescopes you use in the daytime, at these wolves that were probably 2 or 3 miles away. So there were these little tiny dots. And yet, you would think that would be so boring. My husband thought it was a little boring, so he decided not to go on that one. But, and yet, there were a lot of us there who were spending thousands of dollars to stare at wolves from 3 miles away. And when they came into view on the scope, we were in awe. There were these exclamations of, oh my goodness, and you could see them dancing, you know. The young wolves were playing together just like dogs would play together. The older wolves had gorged on this carcass they had killed the night before, and they were lying in the sun and just digesting. And it was amazing. So people do love wolves, and I think it's not just wolves. I think it's also dogs. I think that werewolf books, in some ways, do allow us to put our favorite things about man's best friend into our characters. I know that I personally, some of the characteristics of my werewolves come straight from a dog that we had for over a decade. She was a wonderful dog, and her traits get put into my main characters, especially in the love interest, because who does not want a love interest who's as loyal and dependable as a dog? Anyway, moving on. The fifth, or what is this, the sixth, I can't add, yes, the sixth element that my email list ranked last, but still over a quarter of them loved this, was the pack dynamics element. And this involves, you know, the wolf and human traits combined to make the whole dominance issue I talked about earlier, the power dynamics of you got an overbearing alpha, maybe you have a sassy underdog, whatever. Those are also very fun. Now, the reason I wanted to run through this is because then I posed the exact same question to 2 different reader groups on Facebook. The first reader group is called the Wolf Pack, and it is romance readers, paranormal romance readers who especially like werewolves. And the second group that I posed this question to was fans of urban fantasy, which, as you can guess, were fans of urban fantasy. So these people, when I asked them, it was a little less formal, so I kind of had to guess what their answer slated into in my categories, and most of them didn't take the time to type out 2 or 3 things they loved. They just typed out the one favorite thing they loved about werewolves. So you'll notice that these things add up to 100% rather than coming to more than 100%. And people are focused more on their very favorite things, so some things weren't covered. Also, I didn't give them the option of wolves were just cool, so that wasn't on there. But this graph shows what the urban fantasy readers like the best, and as you can see, a lot of them were really obsessed with the dual animal-human nature, the beast within. And that makes a lot of sense, because from a fantasy standpoint, there's so much world building to play with. There's so much interesting stuff there. And then the pack dynamics were their second favorite part, which slots in there together very well. The found family pack, though, was also important. I do think this is one of the reasons that werewolves are probably the most, not probably, they are the most popular type of shifter out there. Although at the end I'm going to go just a little bit into other types of shifters. Anyway, moving on. Superpowers were also important to some subset of my fantasy readers. And the mate, even though you would think these are people who are reading for fantasy, not romance, the mate was still important to at least 10% of the fantasy readers. Of course, when you look at the romance readers, the mate becomes the #1 most important thing. 40% of the readers said the mate element was their favorite part of werewolf books. Hot alpha got thrown around a lot, and you can look at this yourself. I'm not going to do it because it would be hard for you to follow along on the video, but if you go to the Amazon bestseller list, you can pull up the paranormal romance bestseller list, and there's actually a sub list for werewolves and other shifters, so go to that one, and then pull up the paranormal and urban fantasy bestseller list. And just scroll through there, and you can see just from the pictures on the cover and from the titles, what are some of the most important tropes to those readers. And you'll see on the paranormal romance side, mate is very important. You often see that in the man chest cover, is what I call it, when you just have a guy naked from the waist up. Often mate is even in the title. But equally important to the wolf pack readers were the found family pack element. And I think that's because I love romance, and I don't just read it for the happily ever after. I really enjoy the fact that romance goes into characters and relationships, and that's what the found family is all about, or the pack is all about. It's all about relationships. And finally, pack dynamics, the power and dominance issues, were important to about 20% of romance readers. So, I'm going to pull up one more graph. I hope you like graphs. I like graphs. This one is also from polling my email list, and I wanted to use it to segue into the final main topic I'm going to talk about today, which is types of shapeshifters. I know I've talked for at least half an hour now about werewolves, and I know I didn't say this was a werewolf-only talk. It is about shapeshifters in general. So, what other kinds of shapeshifters do readers really enjoy? Well, I asked my readers, my email list readers, if you could be any kind of shapeshifter, which would you choose? Now, I want you to notice the wording there. I said if you could be any kind of shapeshifter. So that doesn't mean this is their favorite kind of shapeshifter to read about, although I suspect in many cases it does. Because personally, I read all kinds of shifter books. I have read some about mongoose shifters and all kinds of strange things. But if I have a choice, I probably will gravitate towards the werewolf books. However, if you ask me which kind of shifter I would be, if I had to make that decision, I probably would choose to be some kind of bird. Because I'm a major introvert, and if I had to live in a pack, I probably would go crazy. Whereas, also, I live out in the country, so being a bird would be really fun. You could fly over areas. A wolf would be in trouble. People would probably shoot at me around here. Probably, they would definitely shoot at me around here. But if I was a bird, you know, I could fly wherever I wanted, great views, fast commute. So, just keep that in mind. The other thing to keep in mind as you look at this chart is, I was being a little silly when I asked readers to come over and answer this survey. So I said, would you like to be a squirrel shifter? So I don't think squirrel shifters are really as popular as they look based on this graph. But what you will notice is that actually what most of my readers wanted to be was a dragon shifter. And dragon shifters are a really fun shifter. A couple of years ago, they were all over the bestseller list, and I can see why. Dragon shifters are really fun. You got the flying element, just like the bird I just talked about. You got the breathing fire element. Usually they live a really long time. They're usually very rich. So you got all kinds of fun tropes in there for a dragon. The second most common one here, of course, is the wolf shifter, which I've talked about forever, so I'm not going to run into anymore. The feline shifter, I just poured them all in there together, which, of course, could be lions like Curran, or however you pronounce his name, from Ilona Andrews, or it could be a jaguar, or it could be whatever. Usually, these feline shifters are big predators. You will notice that pretty much all of the shifters shift into a predator. Usually that whole power and size and strength is one of the reasons we like the shapeshifter deal. I think that feline shifters have that element of sensuality to them, so they often do very well in romance settings. But as I just said, you know, Ilona Andrews, I wouldn't call that romance. I would definitely call that fantasy. So they can go either way. Alright, moving on. The bear shifters have a small but significant element. I think part of that is due to T.S. Joyce. I totally did not see the appeal of bear shifters until I read some of her books. And her books are just really fun. So I think that she may have dragged bear shifters into the limelight. But I can see how the whole idea, especially for the love interest in a romance novel, bears are very large, they're very strong, and if you go way back to the shamanic element, many people believe that the cave bear was believed to be some kind of very important animal to the people who are making the cave paintings. So it's quite possible that bear shifters may have been one of the first ones that we considered as a culture. But even though you could say that they are most important in romance novels, that's not necessarily true, because you can think about Bjorn from Lord of the Rings. He's clearly a bear shifter, so you can definitely put that in fantasy as well as romance. Alright, so that's just a quick overview of some of the main types of shapeshifters out there. There are obviously many other ones. And in just a minute, I'm going to turn you loose to, I hope, break up into groups and talk a little bit about what you typed in chat. But first, just in case I don't actually manage to show up, if my internet is not playing nice, I want to tell you where you can find me on the internet. AimieEasterling.com is my website. But I also am a firm believer in the whole drug dealer view of book marketing, which is I give you the first one for free. So I have 2 box sets of first in series, which is called Shifter Origins and Shifter Origins 2. And you can actually read the first book in all of my series at the moment in those box sets. So you can go and grab those on the retailer of your choice, and you can read way more werewolf books than you ever wanted to read. Alright, thank you so much for listening. Now I am going to power this off, and we're going to break into groups, and hopefully, if I show up in the chat, discuss some of the ideas that you presented in the beginning yourself. Thank you for listening, and I will see you there.